In Chapter 3, the big focus is on the income statement. And we're looking at the difference between the multi-step approach and the single approach. So I'm going to walk you through both of those using the same numbers here so you can really look at the difference between the two formats. I'm going to start with the multi-step approach. It's a little bit more detailed, probably takes a little bit more time, but the focus of this one is really separating those operating expenses and the non-operating expenses. So if you want to follow along in your book, this is exercise 3.7. You will also have a practice problem on this. Now these problems are going to start changing, so you'll get different numbers. But as long as you walk through it with me, you'll be able to do this without a problem. So for the multi-step approach, we still start with net sales. I'm going to try to write small so this all fits in here. And the net sales are $980,000. I'm going to eliminate, oh, I guess I can't. I'll include all those zeros. What I like to do is just kind of cross out that amount I've used so I know I don't go back and try to take it again. And then it also allows me to have less to look at and find when I'm trying to complete the work. The next step in your multi-step income statement is to bring in your cost of goods sold. And here our cost of goods sold is $496,000. This will give us a total for gross profit. So net sales minus your cost of goods sold will always equal your gross profit. That's your first big key to look for with this multi-step approach. And if I subtract those two, I should get 484. The next thing we're going to list out is our operating expenses. So I'm going to go ahead and put that title in. And then I'm going to list out what my operating expenses are. And I'm going to start with my selling expenses. So I'll list out that title as well. And now I'm going to go through and find all of those expenses that relate to selling. So here it tells me these salaries and wages are selling. So I'm going to put in that amount for salaries and wages. And that was 114, 800. And again, it told me selling, that those relate to selling expenses, so I knew to put those in there. Another expense that I know relates to selling is part of this depreciation expense, so I'll put that in there. And it's 70% of that 65,000. So I take 65,000, I multiply that by 70%, and that's going to equal 45,500. And then I have one more selling expense. If I look through here, I find one more that I didn't bring in yet, so I'll bring in that supplies expense, which was 17,600. I will go through and add these up. Again, I didn't give myself a lot of room here because I wanted to show you comparison. But if I add these all up, it comes to 177,900. And I would just do a total column right next to that. So this is technically looking at 3 columns. I just can't write small enough. All right, so after we list out our selling expenses, we're going to list out our admin expenses. So I'll put that column heading in, and then I'm going to bring in anything else that was administrative cost. So I do have some salary and wage expense, and that was $135,900 right here. I have some other that they list out. It's $51,700, and then I have the rest of that depreciation because the other 30% was administration. So I will list out that depreciation expense as well. You can do the math again. 65,000 times that by 30%, and that's going to equal 19,500. I'm going to total those up, and then right next to that there, put in what that equals, which is 207,100. And then what I'll do is add up the subtotal of all these operating expenses, which equals, so if I add the 177 and the 207, it should equal 385,800, or 385 there. And what I'll do then is compare my total operating expenses to my gross profit. So I'm looking at these two numbers here, my gross profit and my total operating expenses, and that's going to give me my income from operations. And if I subtract those two, you should get 99,000. After we've reached that point, we're almost done. But we have a few other things we're going to look at. After my income from operations, I'm going to pull in my other revenue and gains. And you know you're not done because you haven't crossed off everything yet, right? So I know I have my other revenue and gains. We'll start with that rent revenue I just saw. So this isn't business related rent revenue. I'm not in that industry. I think that was 29,000. I'll pull that in. That's all the revenue I have, so I'll add that up to equal 128. Then I'm going to list out my other expenses and losses. Here, look through here, I have some interest expense, 18,000. And your book details out what goes into each of these categories, so make sure you review that as well. And this will give me my, what we call our income before income tax. Income before income tax. So you can kind of guess what's next, right? Is our income tax. I believe it tells us up here our income tax is $23,100. I'm going to subtract that, and finally that will show me my net income of $86,900. Now you can see we didn't use some of these items, like the market appreciation on land above cost, because that's not going to go into our income statement, nor were the cash dividends that were just declared. That's just a liability. The one other thing that we want to note here is trying to find that earnings per share. So the earnings per share is going to be calculated based on your net income, which we just determined was $86,900. We're going to divide that by the number of shares we have, 20,000. So our earnings per share should be around 4.35. You might have to do some rounding a little bit there. So that's the multi-step. Now, let's take a look at the difference between that and our single step. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and erase everything I crossed out here so that I can do that again. I don't need that anymore. Alright, let's do this in a different color so it stands out a little bit more. And now let's look at this single step. Again, the numbers aren't going to change. Our net sales are going to be the same. Our net income is going to be the same. It's just how it's presented that's a little different. So we start with net sales again, which is 98,000. But here we're listing out all of our revenue. I probably should have put in that line item so you know when you're doing your homework and you need to fill in those boxes that you have to put those totals in. So we have our net sales, our rent revenue, and that was 29,000, and that's going to give us a total revenue of 1,009,000. And this will be listed out as our total revenue. As you can see, it's a little simpler approach, but it doesn't give as much detail. The next thing we're going to do is list out our expenses. Here, we'll start with our cost of goods sold, which is the same, $496. And I didn't cross out the stuff I've used. Otherwise it's going to make it harder when I'm trying to find everything I need to put in here. I'm going to list out my cost of goods sold, list out those selling expenses. Now here you'll notice, I'll find them up here. Our selling expenses are coming from this, coming from this, coming from this. So we need to go ahead and add those three things up to find our total selling expenses. So if I add up the 114,800, that's 17,600, and then I have the 70% of the 65,000. We're going to add that here. If I look over here, that was the 45,500. So my total selling expenses should be 177,900. So I'll list those total selling expenses here. And then we're going to list out our admin expenses. Again, we're going to do the same thing. Find all those administrative expenses that we need to and add those together. And if I did that right, so this was my selling. Let's add my admin expenses I can find. I have 135,900. I have let's see, my 30%, which I can find down here under the depreciation, which is $19,500. And then I'm gonna add in the other selling and administrative costs, which are the $51,700 right here. I'm gonna add all those up together, and I should come up with $207,100. So that will give me my total administrative expenses. So we got all of this included. Now I should have one other expense I need to find. So far it's that interest expense. Which was $18,000. And if I subtract all of those, it's gonna, first let me add them up, give me my total expenses, which is $899. I take my revenues minus my expenses to give me my income before taxes. My income before taxes is $110. And then I'm going to subtract out that income tax. Those are the same numbers, $23,100, to give me my net income, which is $86,900. Right, so you can see the similarities. Again, if you look at that EPS, earnings per share, it's calculated the same way, but since we have the same net income and the same shares outstanding, your EPS is going to be the same as well. So you can see here, my net income's not changing. Even my income before taxes, all of these numbers are staying the same. It's just putting some of our revenues and expenses in different places so that we can use this information as we see fit. One thing I do want to point out is this multi-step gives us our gross profit. That's something we want to make sure we understand, as well as our income from operations. So those two things really highlight the differences between the multi-step and the single approach. So again, looking at this and this homework problem, putting together these financial statements, how does that translate into a multiple choice test question? So the first question focuses on the difference between the single step and the multi-step approach. And then we want to know, what does the single step approach emphasize? Well, the answer here is total revenue and expenses, because you'll notice that the only time you see the gross figure amount is in the multi-step. The only time you separate out the operating and non-operating is in the multi-step. And then the continuing income from continuing operations, that's those other areas, that's only in the multi-step. So again, just highlighting the difference between the two. And then another question you might see is something like this, where it kind of points out, what is the earnings per share? I'm not giving you a whole income statement, I'm giving you the pieces of information that you need. And sometimes there's going to be additional information that you don't need. So That's the question. Do you know what you need and do you know what you don't need? So here, we know we start with our net income, right? It does have, it declared and paid preferred stock dividends of $150,000, common stock dividends of $60,000. We don't care about that. And it had the weighted average of 300,000 shares outstanding. So the question here really is, do you know that you did not need this part? What we need to do is subtract out the amount that goes to those preferred stockholders, and then we'll go ahead and divide by those shares. And that's going to give me $1.50. So therefore my answer would be $1.50. Now if you did this wrong, would the answer be there? Most likely. So it's really a testing. Do you know what you need, what information you need out of the pieces that are given? So hopefully this helps. Go ahead and try that practice problem and then try the other homework. And if you have any questions, please let me know.